Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This YouTube is remembering the year 1917. Woodrow Wilson was president in 1917. The population of America was 103 million. Today, it's 350 million. World War I had been raging across Europe since 1914, and 9 million soldiers would die before it ended in 1918. When World War I began in Europe in 1914, many Americans wanted the United States to stay out of the conflict, supporting President Woodrow Wilson's policy of strict and impartial neutrality. Quote, "The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls." Quote, that was the president. Even though we were supposed to be neutral, we favored Britain and we disliked Germany. The world's largest passenger ship, the Lusitania, was sunk by a German submarine in 1915, killing 1,197 British and American passengers. This is just one of the reasons that America began to hate Germany: unrestricted submarine warfare against ships. On January 11th, unknown saboteurs set off the Kingsland explosion at Lyndhurst, New Jersey, which was an ammunition plant. This was also one of the events leading to the United States' involvement in World War I. By the way, in 1953, Germany paid the United States $50,000 in reparations for this explosion, even though they never admitted it was German saboteurs that did it. On January 16th, the Danish West Indies is sold to the United States for $25 million. On January 22nd, President Woodrow Wilson calls for peace without victory in Germany. In his speech, he tried to say that if there was a war, there would be victors and losers, and building a peace upon victory and defeat was not going to be lasting. We had to build peace without war. On February 3rd, the United States severs diplomatic relations with Germany. In 1916, President Wilson had sent 5,000 U.S. Army soldiers under the command of General John Pershing as he pursued Pancho Villa through Mexico. Employing aircraft and trucks for the first time in U.S. Army history, Pershing's force fruitlessly pursued Pancho Villa until February of 1917. Pancho Villa was a revolutionary in the Mexican Revolution. Unfortunately, he also crossed the border and attacked several towns and villages in the United States. So that's why the government sent an army of 5,000 soldiers into Mexico to try to capture him. He was an outlaw in American eyes. He was a folk hero in Mexican eyes. Finally, on February 22nd, the United States ends its search for Pancho Villa in Mexico. They just couldn't catch him and his 400 bandits. On February 24th, Walter Hines Page, who was the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom, he is shown the intercepted Zimmerman telegram in which Germany offers to give the American Southwest back to Mexico if Mexico will take sides with Germany in case the United States declares war on Germany. What the Germans didn't remember was that the Western Union Telegraph headquarters was in London. So when this telegraph was sent from Germany to Mexico, it went through London, and the English intercepted it and decoded it and told the Americans, hey, look at this. Here's a cartoon of the era, and then this guy playing a German is saying, all you gotta do is beat the stuffing out of that old guy, meaning Uncle Sam, and there's the pie is yours, and the pie is Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, which the Germans said, if you join with us, we'll give those states back to you. On March 1st, General Pershing's troops in Mexico began withdrawing back to the United States. On March 1st, the U.S. government releases the text of the Zimmerman Telegraph to the public. And the headlines read, German plot to join with Japan and Mexico in waging war against the United States is exposed. So here's another reason the United States eventually declares war on Germany. On March 2nd, the enactment of the Jones Act grants Puerto Ricans United States citizenship. On March 31st, the United States takes possession of the Danish West Indies, which becomes the U.S. Virgin Islands after paying $25 million to Denmark. On April 2nd, 1917, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson asked the United States Congress for a declaration of war on Germany. He also asked for 500,000 men to be trained in the army. Germany's resumption of submarine attacks on British and American civilian passenger and merchant ships in 1917 became the primary motivation behind Wilson's decision to lead the United States into World War I. On April 10th, the Eddystone explosion, an explosion at an ammunition plant near Chester, Pennsylvania, kills 139, mostly female workers. With the men marching off to war, women stepped in and began working in the factories in America, just as they did during World War II. On April 17th, the Times and the Daily Mirror, which were British newspapers, print atrocity propaganda of the supposed existence of a German corpse factory processing dead German soldiers' bodies. So they started writing these articles and publishing them, which claimed that the Germans were taking the dead soldiers into these factories, chopping them up, boiling them down to get the fat out of the body. And then they used the fat to make candles and soap. Totally untrue, totally propaganda, but printed in two of the biggest newspapers in England. On April 19th, the Army transport SS Mongolia fires the United States' first shots in the war when her gun crew drives off a German U-boat in the English Channel. On May 18th, the Selective Service Act passes the United States Congress, giving the President the power of conscription. the power to draft men into the Army. On May 21st, over 300 acres, which is 73 city blocks, 73 blocks are destroyed in the Great Atlanta Fire. It all started in a little factory that made mattresses. Unfortunately, the Atlanta Fire Department was ill-equipped to deal with it. Most of the houses were made out of wood, and all of the houses had wooden shingles, so this fire spread very rapidly, totally out of control. On May 22nd, a black man by the name of L. Parsons is lynched in Memphis in connection with the rape and murder of a 16-year-old white girl, Antoinette Rapal. He had been arrested, and the sheriff was moving him on a train, and the white mob stopped the trains and started searching the trains until they found him, and they took him off the train, and he was lynched. On May 26th, an F5 tornado, that is the worst tornado you can record. An F5 tornado strikes Mattoon, Illinois, causing devastation and killing 101 people as it traveled 155 miles on the ground, clear across most of Illinois and into Indiana. Now, this is where Mattoon is, in East Central Illinois. In fact, I went to undergraduate college right here in Charleston at Eastern Illinois University. Anyway, so the tornado comes in from the west and sweeps across Mattoon. This is farming country. My grandparents, Herman and Grace Reece, lived on a little farm south of Arcola, just 12 miles away. Well, this tornado was so devastating that not only did it kill 101 people, it killed thousands of cows and horses and pigs and thousands upon thousands of chickens as it destroyed these farms. So my grandfather, who was a farmer, along with dozens of other farmers in the area around Mattoon, got their horses and their wagons, and they went out into these fields, and they picked up the bodies of these thousands of cows and horses and pigs, and they piled these dead animals up in big piles, and they burned them. On May 13th through October 13th, at monthly intervals, these three young children, 10-year-old Lucia Santos and her cousins, report experiencing a series of Marian apparitions. This means the Virgin Mary. They claim that the Virgin Mary came and talked to them, and this happened in Portugal, Fatima, Portugal, and this became known as Our Lady of Fatima, or Fatima. I'm not sure what the correct pronunciation is. This became so well known and so famous within the Catholic Church that they ended up building this. This huge basilica was built on the spot where these three peasant shepherd children claimed they saw the Virgin Mary. And now this is a huge shrine that millions of Catholics have come to over the decades. On May 27th, the French army mutinies, and over 30,000 French troops refused to go into the trenches at Missy-aux-Bois. On June 5th, conscription begins in the United States, and my 22-year-old grandfather, Herman Reece, was drafted into the Army. On June 8th, a fire at the Granite Mountain and Speculator ore mine outside Butte, Montana, kills 168 workers. On June 13th, the first major German bombing raid on London by a fixed-wing aircraft leaves 162 people dead and 432 injured. On June 15th, the United States enacts the Espionage Act. This was intended to prohibit interference with military operations and recruitment, also to prevent insubordination in the military, and to prevent the support of enemies of the United States during wartime. By June 17th, only about 14,000 American soldiers had arrived in France, and the Americans had only a minor participation at the front lines up to late October of 1917. So for 5 months, the troops were arriving, but they really weren't engaged in the fighting. On July 1st, the first Cottingley Ferries photographs are taken in Yorkshire, England, apparently depicting fairies. There were these two teenage girls that came up with these 5 photographs, and they claimed that these were real, that these were photographs of fairies. Now, this would have been laughed off if it hadn't been for this little fact. By the way, here's another one of the pictures. There were 5 altogether. This man, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, some of you will recognize that name instantly. If you've ever read the books Sherlock Holmes, this is the man that wrote Sherlock Holmes. Anyway, he was writing an article for a magazine on fairies, and he found out about these pictures, and he went and got them and examined them, and he declared that they were authentic. So here you have this very famous author who says, yep, these are real pictures of fairies. And so for about 15 years, people quibbled back and forth about whether or not these were real fairy pictures. This hoax was not admitted by these 2 girls until 1981, when they finally fessed up and said, nope, they were fake. On July 1st through the 3rd, a labor dispute ignites a race riot in East St. Louis, Illinois, which leaves 250 people dead. On July 6th, Arabian troops led by T.E. Lawrence captures Aqaba from the Ottoman Empire. These were allies of Germany. Now, most people had never heard of T.E. Lawrence, but he was leading this Arabian army. This is what he looks like. They begin to call him Lawrence of Arabia. And I remember well the movie Lawrence of Arabia, and the actor Peter O'Toole played Lawrence of Arabia. On July 7th, the Lions Club International is formed in the United States. On July 16th through the 17th, Russian troops mutiny, abandon the Austrian front, and retreat to Ukraine. Hundreds of them are shot by their commanding officers during the retreat. On August 2nd and 3rd, the Green Corn Rebellion, which was an uprising by several hundred farmers who were protesting against the World War I draft. and this took place in central Oklahoma. The Green Corn Rebellion. They were protesting being drafted. These were the men who worked in the fields, and they didn't want to go into the army. On October 13th, these three young children predicted that the Virgin Mary was going to come to Fatima, Portugal, and reveal secrets. And so thousands of people showed up. These are actual photographs of the thousands of people who came expecting to see the Virgin Mary. They also predicted that the sun would do strange and wonderful things. They predicted that the sun would dance across the sky and the sun would radiate these beautiful colors. This is an artist's rendition of what the people expected to see. This is an actual photograph of the thousands of people who came and stood for hours staring at the sun. Now, years later, it was explained, well, what happened is if you stare directly at the sun for hours upon hours, that's going to affect your vision. No wonder you're going to start seeing things. And people reported that they saw the sun dance across the sky, and they saw the sun zoom in and out, and they saw these beautiful colored rays emanate from the sun. And this was all investigated by the Catholic Church and deemed true. Now, this is 1917 that this happened. Years later, in 1950, Pope Pius XII also claimed to have seen the miracle of the sun as he was standing in his gardens at the Vatican. On October 15th, the infamous spy Mata Hari is executed in Paris for spying for the Germans. Now, she was an exotic dancer and a courtesan. A courtesan is a nice way of saying she was a prostitute, and her customers were rich guys. Anyway, she was caught passing secrets to the Germans. The French tried her, and she was shot. Mata Hari. On October 19th, Dallas Love Field Airport is opened in Dallas, Texas, and this is a photograph of the opening day. On October 17th in Russia, the workers of the Petrograd Soviet, that's basically the city council, they revolt, and they were led by Vladimir Lenin, and they stormed the Winter Palace, and they successfully destroyed the Kerensky Provisional Government, which had only been in power 8 months. And this is what triggered the Russian Civil War. On November 7th, in the United States, the women's suffrage in the United States, women win the right to vote in New York State. On November 18th, the Night of Terror, these influential suffragettes from the Silent Sentinels. The Silent Sentinels were a group of women who picketed and protested in front of the White House. Anyway, these women were arrested and they were subjected to physical assault by the guards while they were in jail. On November 17th, United States Navy destroyers, the USS Fanning and the USS Nicholson, capture a German U-boat, U-58, which is a submarine, off the southwest coast of Ireland. This is the first combat action in which U.S. ships capture or take a submarine. After they captured it, they took the crew off and they sank the sub. On November 24th, a bomb kills 9 members of the Milwaukee Police Department, which is the most deaths in a single event in U.S. police history. On December 6th was the Halifax explosion. 2 freighters collide in Halifax Harbor in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and it causes a huge explosion that kills at least 1,963 people and injures 9,000 and destroys part of the city. This was considered the biggest man-made explosion in recorded history, and it would be the biggest explosion up until the nuclear Trinity test of 1945. So when these 2 ships collided and this explosion happened, it was like an atomic bomb going off. On December 6th, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Jacob Jones is torpedoed and sunk in the Atlantic Ocean southwest of the British Isles by a German submarine U-53, killing 66 crew. In the first significant American naval loss of the war, and it's the first ever U.S. destroyer lost to an enemy. On December 26th, President Woodrow Wilson uses the Federal Possession and Control Act to place most U.S. railroads under the United States Railroad Administration, hoping to transport troops and materials for the war effort more effectively. So Uncle Sam took over the railroads to run them the way they needed to be, to get those war materials to the East Coast. Who were the most popular singers in 1917? A guy by the name of Billy Murray. A lady by the name of Nora Bayes. Don't you love that headdress? Here's someone I've heard of, Eddie Cantor. And I remember as a little boy growing up in the mid-1940s hearing this song. If you knew Susie like I knew Susie, oh, 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 what a girl. That was Eddie Cantor. Harry Lauder, he was a Scotsman, and when he performed, this is how he was dressed. And Ma Rainey, who was called the mother of the blues, and there's no doubt what kind of music she sang. What were the most popular songs on 1917? Now, back then, all we had was 78 RPM records, and they weren't made of vinyl, they were made of hard, brittle shellac. So if you dropped these things, they would shatter into 1,000 pieces. I remember my grandparents had one of these, an old Victrola, and you cranked it by hand. Okay? So anyway, what were the most popular songs? Very patriotic, over there, and it was sung by a group called the American Quartet. That was the #1 most popular song. #2, also over there, but this was performed by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. #3, the Darktown Strutters Ball, also performed by the original Dixieland Jazz Band. #4, Poor Butterfly, performed by the Victor Military Band. And #5, the Missouri Waltz, Hush-a-Bye, My Baby, sung by Elsie Baker. What were the top 5 radio shows of 1917? None. A trick question. There were no public radio stations in 1917. There were a few amateur radio guys. Once in a while, they would play a record and broadcast it out over the radio waves, but these were ham operators. No radios in 1917, no radio stations. There were also no television stations in the United States in 1917. The first TV stations would not come until 1939. So imagine, no radio, no television. You wonder what they did at night. The average salary was $687 in 1917. If that's converted to today's dollars, that's still only $18,000. In the United States, the average salary today is somewhere in the high 60s or low 70,000s. So it would have been tough to make a living back in 1917 on just $18,000 a year. In 1917, a new Ford Model T cost $345. That's $9,123 in today's dollars. Pretty cheap car. In 1917, a gallon of gas cost 25 cents. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, boy, that is cheap gas. Not really. That's $6.61 a gallon when that's converted into today's dollars. And cars only got 13 miles a gallon back then, so you could spend a lot of money on gasoline. In 1917, life expectancy was 50.9 years. Today, it's 77 years. And as an 81-year-old man, I'm glad to see those numbers. What were the 5 top grossing movies? Now, they didn't have TV and they didn't have radios, but they had movies. The movies didn't have any sound. They were all silent. But here are the top money-making movies of 1917. Now, I want you to watch what the pattern is here. Here was number 1, Cleopatra. There she is. And she is a woman by the name of Theda Bara. Notice that her name is the only one on this movie poster. There's no mention whatsoever of any other actress or actor. No mention of who her leading man was, just her name, period. Okay, so Cleopatra was the biggest moneymaker. Number 2, The Little American. I've heard of her, Mary Pickford. But once again, hers is the only name on the poster. No mention of who her leading man was. It does mention that Cecil B. DeMille was the producer. So you see the pattern here? They don't really care about the men. All they care about is who was the woman star. Number 3 movie, A Romance of the Redwoods. Once again, Mary Pickford, directed by Cecil B. DeMille. No credits whatsoever for the man or her leading man. Next movie, A Woman God Forgot. Same thing. The woman, Geraldine Ferrara. And when I first saw this picture, I thought, I guess maybe it's another version of Cleopatra. She looks Egyptian. Nope, she's Aztec. This is a story of the Spaniards invade Mexico, and she is the daughter of the Aztec king, and she lets the Spanish soldiers into the palace, and they kill everybody except her, and she ends up falling in love with the Spanish general. Okay, that's supposed to be what an Aztec looked like. Right. The Devil Stone, same woman, Geraldine Ferrara. And the Devil Stone is this big ruby that supposedly has this curse on it. But once again, no mention of the men. All they cared about was who was the woman. And once again, these were all silent movies. No sound, no spoken word. So, what was introduced in 1917? The life jacket. Now, I was in the Navy. And in the Navy, when we would have drills and when we would go to battle stations, we put on our life vest. I could not believe when I saw this. My friends, I've worn a lot of life vests, and I grew up water skiing, so I wore a life vest every Saturday and Sunday in the boats when we water skied. I think I'd rather drown than be caught dead in a life vest that looks like this. When I first I thought, what they've done is they've just wrapped mattresses around themselves because that's what it looks like. Anyway, this is the invention of the life vest in 1917. Oh, Girl Scout cookies were introduced in 1917. I can't count how many dozens of boxes of Girl Scout cookies I have bought over the years. I always told my wife, I want to support our women in uniform, so that's why I buy Girl Scout cookies. Aqua Velva aftershave. I wore a lot of this when I was a teenager. Anyway, it goes all the way back to World War I. Clark bar. I'd like to have $1 for every Clark bar I have eaten over the decades. And I saved the best for last, moon pies. And even their label says it, since 1917. Moon pies came out in World War I. The first film made in Technicolor was released in 1917, and it was called The Gulf Between. During World War I, women wore less jewelry, and the lavish clothing of the Edwardian period fell by the wayside. As women dressed for new roles as factory workers, dress codes relaxed, skirts became shorter, as they often do during wartime, and colors became somber and muted. It is like the women did not want to celebrate by wearing flashy, loud, colored clothes. Women worked as ammunition testers, drill press operators, and welders. They went into every kind of factory devoted to the production of war materials, from the most dangerous posts in munitions plants to the delicate sewing in airplane factories. The airplane wings were made out of cloth back then, so you had to sew the wings. Female Navy yeoman. The U.S. Navy was so short-handed at the beginning of World War I. Now, there was vague wording in a section of the Naval Act of 1916 outlining who could serve, and this created a loophole. Women were able to join the ranks as yeomen, non-commissioned officer, and around 12,000 women enlisted in the Navy under the title yeoman. And they went to sea and they went to war. The Hello Girls. Aiming to improve communications on the Western Front between the Allied forces, General John Pershing called for the creation of the Signal Corps' Female Telephone Operators units. The unit recruited women who were bilingual in French and English to serve as telephone switchboard operators on the Western Front. So these women were right there on the front. They were in battle. Unfortunately, after the war, their services were not recognized, and it wasn't until Jimmy Carter finally authorized the recognition of these women and the payments to these women for their service. So, what were children playing with back in 1917? Peter Rabbit doll was one of the most popular. And when my daughter was born in 1976, her favorite doll was a little bunny, and that's what we called him, Bunny. Miss Tilly Tinker. Now, this is sort of a tinker toy like. So here you have the bottle and the body, and you have these legs, and you stick them on here, and then you balance her on this tripod. Miss Tilly Tinker, 1917. The Wolverine Tin Sand. This was a contraption for boys. This thing went up and down, and the sand went across here, and it dumped in here, and then it came down here. So young boys could be very, very active, moving sand around this device. And in fact, on YouTube, there's a video showing someone playing with this Wolverine Tin Sand. Aha! The erector set was introduced back in 1916, 1917. And when I was about 10 or 12 years old myself in the 50s, I had an erector set. But they go all the way back to 1917. Wonder blocks. When I first saw this, I thought, well, that reminds me of my Lincoln Logs. But instead of building houses and forts, you built people and animals and they showed you on the box cover how to put these together to get the little people and the little animals. Wonder blocks. The mandolin guitarophone. This was a stringed instrument, but it had these keys down here, and you actually played it like a piano. So you would strike the key, and that would pluck the strings. And it sounded like a mandolin. So thank you for watching. I hope you learned something you didn't know about the history of the United States. Be well.